So remember how in my previous Transformers Prime review, if you can remember that far back in history, I said that it really would have been nice if Optimus could remember the information that he gave to Megatron? Well, it turns out the narrative of the show addresses that pretty much immediately at the very beginning of this episode, Operation Bumblebee Part 1. The episode opens on the Autobots investigating an Autobot signal, which turns out was activated when Megatron unearthed something called the Spark Extractor, a powerful Cybertronian artifact, an ancient artifact that can't be replicated with modern technology and is so dangerous that no one should use it ever. An artifact that he only knew how to find because Optimus deciphered that information for him, providing him with the coordinates of where it was hidden on Earth. And Optimus, even before he realizes what the artifact is extremely proactive about this. He's more proactive about this, I think, than he would have been at the start of Season 1, for example. He definitely still has that mentality in mind that he developed towards the end of Season 1, that he needs to stop letting Megatron get away with as much. So instead of waiting for backup and giving Megatron a chance to leave with whatever he found, he and Ratchet go after it themselves. They still call for backup, and Bumblebee does show up and help them retrieve the Spark Extractor without anyone coming to harm, but he's still super proactive about it, and I like that. I like that that little detail was carried over. And it's super important that Bumblebee shows up to help. Bumblebee's role as a scout, as a quick, hyper-competent little guy who can get in and get out super fast and relatively easily, that's very important to this episode. Bumblebee confronts Megatron, he gets the Spark Extractor away, and even manages to put Megatron off balance by making very good use of both his robot and his vehicle modes, and retrieves the Spark Extractor safely to be locked away in the Autobot base where Megatron can't get it, at least for the time being. Like we do learn when we see a snippet of the Decepticon perspective in a couple of scenes, that Megatron does have coordinates to 2 other artifacts. But, I mean, the Spark Extractor? That sounds like a particularly dangerous one. The other 2 are going to have to work extra hard to even sound that scary. However, for some reason, and I can kind of see why this episode and the part 2 that comes after it had both of these plots in it at the same time, while investigating what he thinks might be another signal, Bumblebee is jumped by Mech. Remember those human guys who are interested in Transformers biology and in creating their own Transformer army. Turns out that the information that Mech gathered via their various, let's say, research projects has allowed them to determine what exactly it is that allows a Cybertronian to transform. Something called a TCOG, an organ, a biomechanical organ, which allows a Transformer to scan objects and then turn into them and back. It also, we learn later in the episode, allows them to transform some of their body parts into weapons. Mech jumps Bumblebee, takes his TCOG, because this is something you can't build with the resources on Earth. Like, even with proper resources, it would be incredibly difficult. And then they just peace out without so much as dumping him into a bathtub full of ice. It's really pretty rude. This leads to a scene which, while nothing incredibly spectacular, is a really fantastic example of how good the writing on this show can be. The other Autobots recover Bumblebee, observed by Starscream, who had come to check out the same signal that Bumblebee did, but backed off when he saw what was happening. And back at base, they're able to work out what it is that happened to Bumblebee and who did it. Because Mech is the only group that would want a TCOG. Even Megatron wouldn't stoop to that level. And what we get is a fantastic blend of characterization, and exposition. Good exposition. The kids don't know what a TCOG is, and they don't know how difficult it is to replicate Cybertronian biotechnology, especially the more complex aspects of it, like the TCOG. So, since they're there, the Autobots have a reason to discuss what the TCOG is and explain it to us, the audience, using the kids as a proxy. The kids also kind of step on Bumblebee's toes a little bit here, making him feel worse about the situation when they bring up the possibility of replacing the T-Cog, and Ratchet has to inform them that's just not something they can do. They need to get it back. This also brings up Bumblebee's voice, and the fact that his voice box was damaged, which I think has come up in the show before. Like, I think the kids knew that it was damaged, but this was an interesting reminder of that, and it's particularly interesting because of another scene that happens a little bit later that I'll talk about in just a minute. But this scene, it's so good. Like, we see a lot of scenes of camaraderie between the Autobots, but there are very few scenes of, I'd say, tenderness, I guess, would be a good way of describing it. All of the other Autobots are so supportive of Bumblebee, and some of them are supportive in the wrong ways, but still, they all try so hard to make him feel comfortable with this, and to reassure him that they will do everything they can to make him whole again. Like I said, it's not an amazing scene. It's not like one of the best that this show has to offer. It's nothing to write a literary analysis about or anything, but it's a really good, really solid, really touching scene of excellent characterization for these characters. Skipping ahead a little bit, I want to talk about that other scene that I alluded to a second ago, which is another great scene of exposition. I'm sure that Raph knows about Bumblebee's voice box. He knows that Bumblebee's voice box was damaged, and that's why Bumblebee talks differently than the other Autobots. But I'm willing to bet that he never really thought about it up to that point, that he never really thought about the fact that, technically speaking, Bumblebee is disabled. And so when Ratchet comes to pick him up at school, since Bumblebee can't right now, since he can't transform, he thinks to ask Ratchet what happened, and we learn the backstory of how Bumblebee received that injury, that he was captured by the Decepticons and interrogated to the point that they had damaged him so badly that he was effectively scrap. And while Ratchet doesn't make it explicit to Raph, we do see through one of those cool storybook-style flashbacks that the field medic who found Bumblebee and treated him at a triage facility, the one who didn't do a good job of repairing Bumblebee as he might have been able to, and who blames himself for Bumblebee's lasting injury and disability, is Ratchet. It was Ratchet, as a much younger medic. And it creates this excellent new dynamic between the characters, while also adding a little bit of depth to Ratchet, because you can tell that he genuinely regrets his ineptitude at the time, and I understand why he values all of the experience that he's accumulated up to this point as much as he does. He sees that experience as a means to prevent himself from making mistakes like that again. And it also explains why when he does make mistakes, he's hard on himself about it. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic small detail that just creates so much depth for this character that we already know pretty well at this point. As all of this is happening, we see a couple of other things happen. Mech installs the T-Cog into their own work-in-progress transformer, and it doesn't work. However, their failure to make it work is witnessed by Starscream, who followed them home. It is, after all, his turn this week to join up with Mech. So he joins up with Mech, offering to help them find Energon that they can use to hopefully fast forward their progress a little bit. Because he needs Energon too, but he doesn't have the resources to find it. They do, but they don't know what to look for. This doesn't really come of anything in this episode. It's just a little bit of setup, and it is worth mentioning. There are a couple of other scenes in here, fillery scenes of Bumblebee puttering around base, because he can't really go out scouting without his vehicle mode. He does have to be a robot in disguise while on Earth as much as possible, after all. So he's just puttering around base. And he's offended by one thing after another. First, it's a video game with car racing in it. And then it's RC rolling into base in her vehicle mode. And I get it. I get why he's so put off by this stuff. I get that he's missing a part of himself. And this is also good characterization. I don't like watching it very much. This is not a good color on Bumblebee. I don't find it enjoyable to see him this way. It is interesting, though, to think about. I mentioned that Bumblebee, for as long as his voice box has been effectively destroyed, he has been technically disabled, but now this additional handicap, it's affecting him so much more than I would imagine that ever did, because it didn't affect his everyday life. Even though he didn't talk like the other Autobots, they could still understand him. And even his closest human friend, inexplicably, could understand him. Now, though, this new handicap is getting in the way of him living his everyday life as he would live it. That's why it was so important that when he confronted Megatron early in the episode, we saw how important his vehicle mode is to what he does. Like, the episode could have just reminded us of the fact that his vehicle mode is important by having them mention that he has to remain in disguise while he's rolling around human-populated areas, or by showing us that scene where Ratchet rolled up to pick up Raph instead of Bumblebee. But that added scene at the beginning that showed how much more effective he is in combat with his vehicle mode, I don't think the episode would have been nearly as good without it, considering the climax to this episode that we're given. Bulkhead picks up, using the base computers, what he thinks might be another artifact signal, and Bumblebee, the only other Transformer present when he does so, convinces him to go after the signal and take just Bumblebee with him without contacting anyone else first. He insists that they can handle it. He wants to prove himself. He wants to prove that he is still of use even without this ability that he used to possess. And as an audience member, you're sitting there thinking, of course you're still of use, Bumblebee. You shouldn't be so worried about proving yourself. But that doesn't matter. The episode did a fantastic job already of establishing the fact that Bumblebee very quickly slipped into a mindset where he feels the need to prove himself, and so it makes sense that he would want to prove himself here. And when they get there, it's breakdown and knockout. The perfect pair for Bulkhead and Bumblebee to counter on a regular day. But without his vehicle mode, Bumblebee just isn't fast enough to catch up. He is clever though, so he comes close, but in the end, he only comes as close as he does because Knockout won at a sporting race. Once he actually wants to leave Bumblebee behind, he does easily. And we're given a fake out where Bumblebee drives off a cliff, and we're supposed to assume that he might die from it, but it's just a cliff, and he's a giant metal robot. He's not going to die from it. It's really not a question, and that's where the episode ends off. And this is just such a good episode. Like, I think I've done a pretty good job of interjecting my thoughts throughout this review, so I'm sure you understand at least mostly why I think this is such a good episode. The characterization in this is just great. The writing's tight. Everything fits together super well. The stuff with Mech is kind of out of nowhere. It's a little hard to see why it would be paired up with this A-plot, I guess. I guess the A-plot would be the Cybertronian artifact thing, and the Mech thing would be a B-plot. It's hard to see why these two stories would be paired up with each other until the second part of the episode, at least. And even then, it's a little flimsy, but it still works. Neither plotline really detracts from the other. And I think most conspicuously, this is a perfect example of what a Season 2 episode of a show should do. We've gotten to know these characters well enough at this point that things need to be mixed up. These characters need to be taken out of their comfort zone in order for us to learn more things about them, because this is only Season 2, mind you. There are still definitely more things to learn about these characters. And so that's what they do. They take Bumblebee out of his comfort zone while making a point at the top of the episode to remind us of what his comfort zone is. And then by extension, they take a bunch of the other characters out of their comfort zones as well and give us the opportunity to see those characters in this new situation, contrasting the way they react here to the way they react to a typical threat. It's the same thing that they did, technically speaking, by turning Optimus back into Orion Pax. It's an extension of the same great writing and the same great writer's mindset that gave us that fantastic 3-part episode. It's only by virtue of the fact that Prime is just overall a really well-written show, aside from a few low points, that I can't bring myself to say that this is one of the best episodes of the series. At least, in my opinion. Still, best or not, this is still an excellent episode. I like it a lot. All of that said, though, guys, what did you think of Operation Bumblebee Part 1, if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys Later.